Hello and welcome to Sticky from the Inside, the employee engagement podcast that looks at how to build stickier, competition-smashing, consistently successful organisations from the inside out. I'm your host, Andy Goram, and I'm on a mission to help more businesses turn the lights on behind the eyes of their employees, light the fires within them, and create tons more success for everyone. This podcast is for all those who believe that's something worth going after and would like a little help and guidance in achieving that. Each episode, we dive into the topics that can help create what I call stickier businesses. The sort of businesses where people thrive and love to work, and where more customers stay with you and recommend you to others because they love what you do and why you do it. So, if you want to take the tricky out of being sticky, listen on. Okay then, I would like to think that this podcast is helping people get their heads around the challenges of authentically building better workplace cultures where hordes of engaged employees thrive and lead more fulfilling work lives and are led by genuine, caring and inspirational human leaders. And I hope the things we cover in each episode really do help in that sense. And then throughout the process of bringing this podcast to the world, I get to meet some really interesting people with great stories and insights into that world of engagement and culture at work. Now, I've learned loads from my guests, and hopefully I've added to their viewpoints too by adding my own experiences and perspectives along the way. And whilst we might have some differences, there's nearly always a meeting of minds. Now, I say nearly always because today's guest totally disarmed me recently with a seemingly simple question, which I would normally back with equally simple response. But he said, well, what is employee engagement anyway, Andy? And as we got talking and he followed it up with other questions, I thought, we really just need to talk about this on the podcast. So here we are today. So today I'm joined by Rob Robson, who's the People Science Director for the People Experience Hub. And these guys are looking at engagement and engagement data and insight and action planning through a slightly different lens to the norm, which we can find out more about today. He's a well-known voice in the people engagement community and has spoken on the topic numerous times. And he's with me today to give me his perspective on that seemingly simple question to see where we agree, where there might be some differences, what the science says, and hopefully point to a more effective way going forward. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Morning, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Hey, great to have you here, my friend. We do love a bit of science on this show, and we love a bit of engagement, and so you combine the two beautifully. So I'm looking forward to our chat today.
Well, I hope so.
Well, the one question we had previously where you asked that question, well, what is engagement anyway, Andy, kind of like totally flummoxed me for a little bit. So I'm sure we'll get into that. We've met briefly before, but my guests really don't have too much of a clue. So could you perhaps just give us a little bit of insight into you, what you're up to, and what's currently kind of making the grey cell turnover at the moment?
Yeah, so as you said, People Science Director and COO for the People Experience Hub, and we're an employee survey, employee feedback platform, and our kind of purpose really is to transform the experience of people at work through through better data, through better insights, and so that's where obviously we come into contact with ideas like engagement and that sort of stuff. But we're also trying to solve a lot of problems that my business partner Nick and I both experienced in our roles in HR, which was that there's a lot of tech companies selling a solution which can allow you to do a survey, but don't give you much in the way of kind of help to drive the value from it. Or there's people who are from a marketing background saying, well, we can measure customer experience, so surely we can measure employee experience. And there's a lot of companies out there that have a very fixed view of what you should be measuring. And we believe that you should be measuring something that is relevant to your own business context. And that's why we offer a very tailored approach to surveys. And that opens up loads of questions about so what are we measuring? What is engagement? All that sort of stuff. And, it's very interesting.
I think it's really interesting. And this is why I say you've got a slightly different lens to it. It's not that we're coming at this from different angles at all, really. But I think the point you make about having some rooted context in what the business actually does and wants to achieve, this is one of the big things that I think is lacking in a lot of measurement criteria out there, and certainly in some of the things that I see. And even related topics, you talk about things like purpose. People are getting caught up in the whole holier than thou, worthy purpose. But reality is it's got to be set on what the business actually does and what the people actually do in there and can connect to, if it's going to have any sort of resonance. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating conversation. So this question that you asked me, right? What is engagement anyway? What were you really trying to get at with that question that absolutely poleaxed me?
Well, I suppose it's sort of a bit of a loaded question, or possibly a rhetorical question, because I don't think we know. Yet. And you talk about the science. I think the science of employee engagement is still quite nascent, and even though it has a history now of it's 32 years since William Kahn published his framework on employee engagement, or not at that stage employee engagement, but on personal role engagement. We've come some way, but I think there's an awful long way to go. And as you mentioned in the pre-chat, there are so many different definitions of what engagement is, and that raises so many challenges when it comes to things like measurement. There's no simple answer to it. It's a real topic, because one of the things that I talked to my business partner Nick, who comes from a more practical background, I suppose, in HR. Whereas I slightly have a bit more of an academic perspective, and he'll say, well, we know employee engagement is a thing, right? And we go, yeah, but we have real trouble actually deciding what it is.
Well, look, let's play a bit of a game. Well, I say a game. To your point about many definitions, and my goodness, there are many definitions. I've just plucked out a handful of employee engagement definitions, right? And so let's have a chat about them and see what we think. So where do you start when you're looking for the world authority to definitions and accuracy? Wikipedia, clearly. I mean, it's, the world's greatest reference tool. So if even Wikipedia has got its own definition for employee engagement. So they say employee engagement is a fundamental concept in the effort to understand and describe both qualitatively and quantitatively the nature of the relationship between an organization and its employees. Full stop. So that's what Wikipedia says. Then interesting. Hold that thought. I'm a volunteer for Engage for Success, right? So we know about Engage for Success, and the Engage for Success document written, I guess, nearly 11 years ago now by David McLeod. At the start of that document, they say employee engagement is a workplace approach resulting in the right conditions for all members of an organization to give of their best each day, committed to their organizational goals and values, motivated to contribute to organizational success with an enhanced sense of their own well-being. There's quite a lot in there. And then I picked out, just because, if you talk about surveys, people are going to mention Gallup, right? I could have picked Aon Hewitt. I could have picked anybody, right? But I've picked Gallup. So Gallup are slightly less effusive in that they say the involvement and enthusiasm of employees in their work and workplace. Done. That's it. That's what they say.
Yeah.
And then there's me. So I thought I would chuck mine in there to be pulled apart. But when I talk to people, I sort of say it's the extent to which your employees feel connected to the business they work in, the people they work with, and therefore motivated to make discretionary effort to contribute to its success. That's me.
Yeah.
So there's 4. We could have picked any, right? But come back to your point about many definitions. Which one's right? They're all different. What are we trying to talk about here? What in your perspective is we're looking to measure?
Well, that is one of the big quandaries that the academic research has struggled with is is it a psychological state? I'm engaged right now. Is it a trait? I'm generally engaged. Is it a process, which is a bit more like what I think the Engage for Success was talking about? Or is it a practice? Is it? There's also, and this is one of the challenges that's out there. My view is it's a psychological state, but it's also, but we should also recognize that there is a practice of engaging. So what we do is the engaging, and what we're aiming for is engagement,
which is the output, right? Engagement being an output, right?
We see it as an outcome. We see it as an outcome, and I think what's interesting there is thinking about the Wikipedia one. It talked about the relationship with the organization. I think,
organization, its employees.
It's and I think it's a lot of the stuff out there. It's started really in about engagement with the work, and I think Gallup recognised that. Now, I'm a little bit anti-Gallup.
That's okay. That's okay.
Put my cards on the table, because I just think that the whole process of reducing the whole idea that there are 12 questions that predict an organization's performance, and the contribution to performance through engagement is a tricky one to kind of really justify. It's a very reductionist kind of idea, but I like the definition. And I think there's an honesty to it, which is, okay, it includes both the relationship with work and with, it says workplace. I probably prefer with the employer or the organization.
Yeah.
But it talks about involvement and enthusiasm. And I think this cuts to the core of one of the challenges I have with engagement is that for me, engagement is a motivational construct.
Yeah.
Right? It's about motivation. And if we refer to different types of motivation, potentially I think it's a little narrow. And Gallup actually described what I believe employee engagement as a psychological construct is, which is that involvement and enthusiasm.
Yeah.
It's a bit like you might talk about things like flow, intrinsic motivation, but it's very much about the here and now. I feel good. I'm enjoying my work. I feel enthusiastic, energetic, all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the challenges I have is that's only part of the jigsaw. And we get obsessed about the idea of employee engagement as being part of the jigsaw, which I see as part of the jigsaw. We're not talking about the jigsaw as a whole. What does it look like? What does a range of positive states look like at work? We get very fixated on the sort of, and when you look at engagement in that sense, it's like, it's the happy clappy kind of stuff, and we're all on board, and I think it's challenging.
Well, I mean, the numbers would suggest it is, isn't it? Because for 20 years or so, the global workforce engagement numbers haven't moved a jot, really.
Yeah. No.
Why is that?
I mean, I'd be cautious about that, because it usually is people like Gallup who are saying that, and they take a very pessimistic approach to measuring engagement. Unless you score a 5 out of 5, you're not really going to count as being fully engaged. I think they skew. I think the data gets skewed, but I do think we haven't achieved an awful lot. And I think that is partly because perhaps we have been too narrowly focused in what we do. And I think for me, there's two ways of cutting this. One is to think of the CIPD sort of say that we should think of employee engagement as a kind of a broad umbrella, broadly akin to your people strategy, under which different constructs could sit. So things like work engagement could sit underneath that. And I think we'd say, so what's on? And then so that would say, well, so what's under the umbrella? So I guess that's a bit like me saying engagement is a piece of the jigsaw. Well, what's the jigsaw? Or we say, right, let's actually start to define employee engagement in a more holistic way that recognizes other positive if you like, I was going to say psychological contributions to, motivational contributions, but there is also a criticism that the whole concept of employee engagement is too psychological and not sociological enough. And I'm not an expert in sociology, but so, but say, like, how could we broaden the definition of it to not just, I've asked the question of people before. Do you really think employee engagement is anything more than enthusiasm? And it's interesting that Gallup used that word.
Yeah.
And then, because when you look at that, you go, okay, there are other positive emotional ways to be at work. And engagement is so focused on that definition of focus of engagement is very much about, like I said, I'm on board. I'm on board with this. What about when we feel very strongly committed to the organization and its success, but we think it needs to go down a different path, and we challenge, and we care, but actually what we're doing in that situation is expressing some of our frustrations or asking difficult questions of the leadership. Is that engagement?
It would sound like it to me, because it plays to the involvement with a business more than just turning up, being present. And then this is why I talk about a connection, right? Because that to me evokes some form of care with what happens, not just going along for the ride, which I think is what you're sort of describing here a bit.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that would be borne out in what's generally measured.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
And so I think we need it's almost like, I suppose, a bit more of a grown-up debate in organizations about what engagement looks like. And actually, one of the things that we do is we don't really try and define engagement as such. And we've got, we focus on the people experience, and we've got a little framework that describes, and it's deliberately quite loose, I suppose, we describe 3 levels. One is the perceived environment. So what do I see? Do I think things work around here? Do I feel like I'm well managed? Do I think we communicate well? Do I think the people practices are fair and all that sort of stuff? And then we've got the felt experience, and that talks more to psychological sort of constructs. And we put our own words around those, our own titles, but it's things like autonomy, purpose, belonging, growth, enjoyment, which is often missed out, but it's at the heart of engagement. And there's one, connection, emotional connection. And then, so that's the felt experience. And then the third level is the outcomes. And that's where we tend to look at engagement. But we tend to look at, a few of the researchers over the years have referred to the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral aspects of engagement. We look at some of the descriptions of cognitive engagement, which is really about people's evaluation of their experience. That's possibly what sits in the felt experience.
Yeah.
In level 2. So we're focused more then on the behavioral or intended behavioral elements of engagement and things like emotional commitment to the organization. But we're also not that strict about how we define it, because in the conversation, when we're trying to set up a survey with people and say, what do you want to measure? We'll start with those outcomes and say, well, look, what's important to you as a business in your context? What are you looking for? What do you want to see? And in a way, what does engagement look like to you? What would engaged people do? They might say, they would want to stay. They would recommend us to their people. Say, great, that's may or may not be what would come up in an academic kind of scale around engagement. It certainly comes up in most of the commercial ones. But we might say, but increasingly clients are saying things like, well, we want them to be, to be positive about change. and we want them to be, and they might say, well, we want to see them challenge us, and we say that's great because that. But so let's build those, and so we quite often would have an engagement sort of index there, which isn't necessarily 100% true engagement, and in all honesty, they wouldn't necessarily always hang together as a set of questions. So what we often do when we're doing like our assessing drivers is we'll assess them individually. We'll look at what's driving this, the results of this question and that question, that because of all different outcomes in some cases. But we also will say, well, what about things like well-being, burnout, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't always focus on engagement, though most of our clients tend to want to see something around engagement.
I think it's typical now when you look at some surveys, they sort of fall into either two or three camps, really. That yes, there's the Gallup 12 rationalized, boiled down to 12 questions, short, sharp, which again, context for some businesses, that might be fine, right? At the other end of the scale, there's the all-encompassing Oracle survey of just tell me everything I could possibly want to know. Which is fine in some context, but what the worry for me on the survey stuff is a survey done like that makes it even harder to go back and talk about what's been said and actually put actions in place and explain why things are going to change and why things aren't going to change, which to me are fundamental principles of having any kind of survey that is seen as worthy by the employee. Because if you're taking the time to bare your soul and fill out the questionnaire, that the very least you should expect is an answer back, right? And I think this is where a lot of the survey work that I see falls over, is that they tick the box of asking lots of questions. They pick out the answers that they want to answer and think about doing some actions and maybe do some, but the rest of it is still under a shroud somewhere and no one ever knows and you never hear. And then you read the verbatim comments of engagement surveys and they go, I'm not sure why I'm bothering doing this because nothing's ever said or nothing's ever changed. And then somewhere in the middle is a hybrid, right, of these things that kind of go on. I mean, when you're talking to clients, do they generally come with a very clear idea about what they want to achieve, or are they wandering around in the wilderness looking for guidance?
It's very much a mixture. And we do know, there are companies out there who go, you know what, we just need a platform. Thank you very much. Yeah. We know what we want to ask, and we have great analytical capability and all the rest of it. So great, fine. But actually, most clients we deal with, and I suppose what we're talking about here is really in that sort of mid-range, not the biggest corporate clients, but people with a sizable employee base. Yeah, they don't have massive HR teams. They can't invest hugely in that capability to design and analyze an effective survey and implement all the results and all that sort of stuff. And it shouldn't be an HR thing, but it does fall to HR to manage the process.
It's just that does frustrate me, I think, about engagement. But
but we have clients who really do get it at the level of leadership team really have a stake in this. The senior leadership team, they really want to know that it's going to add value, and that's great because you just know that you're working with an open door then. Mm-hmm. But what we see it is quite mixed. So we see people come with some historical questions. So they want a bit of a connection to the past to be able to see whether there's progress or not. But they also perhaps want to, some just want to sort of tidy it up and see, could you improve this a bit? And some people will, and others will come and say, look, we've got some ideas, but they could really do with some guidance.
Are there any misconceptions they sort of turn up with in the main?
The biggest problem is probably they'll say, these are the things that we think are important to focus on, and we want 40 questions or even 25 questions or whatever, and go, okay, that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
But but we have also worked with clients who have come to us and said, I mean, what I think of one in particular, where they hadn't run a survey for 11 years, the people director was very skeptical, but had been told that kind of at a group level they had to do something. And she said, I don't want to do the usual stuff, and I really want it to reflect what's important to us as a business. And we literally, with them, started with a blank page. As we tend to do with our clients, took in, so what have you got in terms of people strategy? What have you got in terms of the culture you're looking for, values, behaviors? Let's take all that on board, and then we'll look at kind of what are the themes here, and how do we break that down into questions? And that's really interesting, from my point of view, to do that. So yeah, it does. It really does depend.
Yeah. So I want to dive into some of the bits that you've talked about it being a bit narrow, and perhaps looking at more of the psychological part of this, perhaps. And you introduced a word in the original conversation of emotivation, that sort of combination of emotion and motivation. And so if you think about that and your point about outcomes around engagement, what's missing? What's missing from your perspective of employee engagement, and what needs to be included?
So I'll take a step back into, this is heavily influenced by a particular kind of theory that I've worked with over the years called reversal theory. And it like you say, you mentioned the word emotivation. It's a broad theory that creates sort of structural links between motivation and emotion. And in a lot of settings over the years, I used it almost as a sort of a form of, Johari's window, and put all 8, and I'll look at a situation and try and look at it through all 8 of those motivations, those motivational states. So those motivations are like operating values rather than, a desire. It's about what do I want in this situation. So it's things like achievement, enjoyment, duty, freedom, power, control, care, and there's self and other. So we sort of talked about all that there. And so I look at that. So I often do that conceptually, look at things and go, well, and I see employee engagement sitting in very much in this. First of all, it's what I would describe as broadly conforming. It's about it's about being it's a sort of are you on the bus question.
Yeah.
Whereas if you flip over to what we describe as a rebellious, freedom related orientation, that's where people would say, look, I care, but I really care about the organization, and I want to be on board, and it's important to me, but I think we're going about this the wrong way, and I need to see some change here. That's a very different perspective. So I don't think, so there's an element that I think is not covered. And I think what reversal theory also does is it gives us a way of separating out how I'm motivated or how I feel about what I'm doing, my activity, versus how I feel about my external world, my interactions with the world, my relationships. And for me, that is that thing about saying, okay, actually, we probably need to be quite explicit about that piece about my relationship with my work and my relationship with the organization, and find a way of separating, perhaps defining and measuring those slightly separately. Yeah, as part of a bigger, construct. So I think it's very much at the moment, employee engagement is very much about A, conforming, and B, committing to the other, which is the organization.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's a related point, but it doesn't necessarily link entirely. But also something you mentioned at the start, when we kind of joked that enjoyment wasn't included, and enjoyment is specifically one of those 8 types of motivation. But interestingly enough, there's that HBR article some time ago that talked about 8 types of culture, and I'm not trying to 8 and 8 and 8 and 8 and 8 and 8 and 8, but
no. But obviously I was drawn to that as well.
But enjoyment is one of those 8 types of culture.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, only 2% of organizations that get measured on this stuff would put themselves forward as saying, we are primarily an enjoyment orientated culture. Whereas the vast majority of us would say 89% are all about results, right?
Yeah.
And how do these two things link?
Well, the very essence of employee engagement, when you look at things like vigor and absorption, not so much the dedication, but the vigor they are all about enjoyment.
Yeah.
Now, we might not think about enjoyment in the sense, that might not sound like it to some people, well, isn't enjoyment like fun? Well, no, it's also about being absorbed and involved in what you do. It's about being present in the moment and not necessarily just about having a bit of a laugh. So I think it's really interesting because enjoyment is really central to the concept of employee engagement.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Particularly work enjoyment, particularly work engagement. And yet, how many organizations who would say that employee engagement is really important to them actually care that much about enjoyment?
Yeah.
Or unwittingly put barriers to it, because anything that creates fear in any way is a barrier to enjoyment. Anything that overplays goals, short-term micromanagement, short-term focus on results, etc., all acts as a barrier to that sense of enjoyment, which is really a huge part of any construct of employee engagement.
100%.
So there's this mismatch between what people think they want and what they do.
That's exactly my point. I think there's a definite mismatch on this stuff, and whether you call it a say-do gap, whatever it is, you can talk about, we want to have fun, enjoyment, and the minute someone's laughing in an office, well, that's going to affect other people. Come on, calm down, get back to work, be productive. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I'm at my most productive when I'm enjoying myself, when I'm having fun, because I am motivated to keep going, and go deeper and go further and try harder.
And I think there's a bit of a mismatch on the other side as well, which is if you look at the relationship part, the relationship with the organization, it's very much about committing to subordinating yourself to the organization and its goals, right? If you're really engaged, you know what you care about is not yourself, but you care about the organization. But what do we ask in employee surveys, engagement surveys? We sort of tend to ask about how good it all feels for you. And then, there are principles like reciprocity and all that sort of stuff.
Of course.
But there is a little bit about, we assume that if people actually feel cared for example, then they will be more committed to the organization. Well, you may not get that. You might get that. You might be feeding the beast in terms of I've said this to a client before. I said, I think you have to be careful now about how much more you chase. Looking at your drivers of engagement, they're very individualistic, but you keep telling us year after year, you tell us, and in the surveys, you want to know about teamwork. And what this 3 years of data is saying to me is you've got a very individualistic culture, and at the moment, engagement goes up more if you feed that, but that's maybe not what you need.
There you go.
Again, it comes into definition of engagement, because I think you would really want to include in engagement that feeling of commitment to the collective, but we tend, it's slightly different, a bit of a mismatch between what we think we want and what we actually then ask for, or what we actually go out and build. Yeah. And it's also a little bit paradoxical, and there are tensions, and that's the point about employee. Whether you call it employee engagement, whether you call it people experience, it is complex.
So it is complex. So with so many variables and outcomes and things to measure, what do you think the way forward for the measurement of employee engagement is going forward, Rob?
I think the big thing is that it needs, we need to accept that it's not necessarily something that can be reduced to a really, really neat construct.
Yeah.
It's a big, if we call the overarching thing employee engagement, except that it's big and complex. And I think the academic world is guilty of kind of trying to reduce everything to, down to those neat little buckets. I know that, I think there are fashions in that world, and things like what we describe as a general theory is unfashionable. But actually, you probably need that kind of holistic approach, and I think they need to expand it and consider more flavors, if you like, of engagement.
I think, covering some of those concepts you've talked about, the emotion, the motivation, the psychological, thinking about those things rooted in some sort of business context makes tons of sense, right? Tons and tons of sense. Yeah. In terms of...
And I was going to say, and is there even a, maybe it's a bit deep, but do we even need to study employee engagement? Do we just go back to, the basic principles around things like motivation? We sort of invent stuff just for the sake of it. Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, at the end of the day, is it trying to get to the number of it at the end of the day? Do you feel motivated to work here? Do you feel motivated to be here? How much do you want to play a part in its success? I think, those are probably things at the core of it. I'm sitting there going, right, we've pretty much come towards the end of the show, which is where I now introduce sticky notes, which is very unfashionable way of condensing everything down into 3 little points, Rob. So if you could bear with the format, if you were to give 3 little bits of advice to anyone listening to this today about how they could, I guess, take more, get more, or have a more effective measure for employee engagement going forward, what 3 little bits of advice you could stick on a Post-it note would you give them, my friend?
Yeah, I think one would be have a critical eye. Speaking as a supplier, don't take for granted that what people are telling you has actually got any substance to it. That's a freebie. Then I think do focus in on what's important in your business and to your business, and look at your business strategy and how are we going to execute that, and what kind of behaviors and values and and culture do we need in order to execute that successfully, and focus your efforts there. And then I think to really get value from anything you do, you make sure that whether you're investing in it directly in your own team or whether you're bringing people, suppliers in to support you, the analysis is really important. Using statistical analysis to understand what's driving what is actually really important, because you're presented with a lot of data, and actually it can actually lead you down the wrong path and take you away from what's really important.
So true. The interpretation of those results is absolutely critical, isn't it, in helping you make the right decisions. That's great. 3 backed up by data, scientific sticky notes at the end there. Thank you for that. I feel like we've kind of just scratched the surface of this topic. I'm going to have to get you back at some stage to go a bit deeper.
I honestly feel like I'm just scratching the surface of it, and I would love to do more, research. It's a different job, and maybe one day when we've got a bigger team and all that sort of stuff.
Amazing. Well, look, I've loved talking to you today. As I say, I always love a bit of science and a bit of fact, and you've made me think. I don't think we're that diametrically opposed onto what we're thinking about when it comes to employee engagement. And look, thank you for sharing your time and your insights with the audience today, mate. I really appreciate that.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. That was Rob Robson. And if you'd like to find out a bit more about him and any of the things we've talked about today, please check out the show notes. So, that concludes today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, found it interesting, and heard something maybe that will help you become a stickier, more successful business from the inside going forwards. If you have, please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps. I'm Andy Goram, and you've been listening to the Sticky from the Inside podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.